Alrighty. Well, it doesn't look like anyone's on, but I'll record this anyway, just in case. Hello. Hello, everybody. It's good to see you. Before I do anything, I just have to say thank you for you all for being so understanding and empathetic and not just making fun of me when I was crying last week, because it would have been easy to do that. So I just really appreciate it. And turns out I missed an email that changed my start date and like it wasn't in the thread. And anyway, I am no longer endangering the campus community, which I was told I was doing. So that's good at least. All your grades are in. You will notice if you like hadn't done any of the SGAs, for example, I put in some zeros. You can still turn those in. But you know, I had to give a general sense of how you were doing right now, essentially, to give you accurate midterm evaluations. So you will see those in WebAdvisor and all your grades up to date on Blackboard, including the midterm. People generally did pretty well on the midterm and like made fewer of the same mistakes I typically see. So like only a couple people said as a neuropsychologist, you do an MRI instead of, you know, like a waist or something. So that was great. I would say the most like common issue was just not writing enough for the essay to like give a fleshed out enough answer. But generally otherwise really good. So the second half of the semester, a couple things happen. So first of all, we go generally fairly slowly, except for this week, of course. You know, why would my schedule be easy this week or yours? But so we'll do one topic today, and then we'll start a new one next week. And then basically until mid-November, we'll go through as we have been going through. Your next quiz is not next week, but the following. And then after mid-November, so sort of right before Thanksgiving break, you all start giving your presentations. So make sure you're working with your groups. The other thing to be aware of is the 28th, your group project outlines and meetings with me are technically due. If you need to, again, go a little bit beyond that, that's okay. The best way to schedule that is to get together with your group, find a time that all works for you on my Calendly and just get and usually these are pretty short. Essentially, I just go over what you have in your outline and tell you like, oh, you're missing this piece, or you have way too much information. This is going to take 2 hours instead of 45 minutes, right? So I try to give you guidance on that. The other thing you have coming up due next week, I don't know why I have it saying due in class, it's due on Blackboard. So you have till the end of the day. I'm not taking anything in paper this year if I don't have to. So is your short paper. Now your short paper can be about your group project topic. It doesn't have to be. So your short paper, if you have your copy of the syllabus handy, it is on page 4. So it's 3 to 5 pages. So nothing, it really actually short, right? And you're looking at a particular brain structure that when it's damaged, it's linked to a specific disease, right? And it can be anything we've talked about in class. So for example, if you wanted to do the basal ganglia and one of the movement disorders, that would be fine. So you could see what you basically, if you just sort of follow this rubric as like an outline for your paper, you'll get a really good grade as long as you've like filled in each one enough. So, you know, where is this part of the brain? This is like frontal, dorsal, right? What else is it around? What's going on with the structure? Is it, you know, does the structure shrink? Does it get damaged, right? Things along those lines. What neurotransmitters are involved? Is it dopamine? Is it GABA? Is it, you know, maybe not those, but there are other chemicals like cortisol that are implicated. Look at things like that. Then the dysfunction, the types of damage, how the damage is acquired. And sorry, so the structure, sorry, I'm like confusing myself, being back and forth, y'all, it's a lot. So the part where I said structure above is literally just like, how big is the structure? You know, what else is it connected, interconnected with? So the dysfunctions where you talk about what sort of damage happens to the structure. And then the assessment part, how would a neuropsychologist assess this? So what neuropsychological assessments would they use? Would it be memory tests? Would it be, you know, specific things that are developed for this particular disorder, right? Those exist, for example. And since this is a paper, not an exam, I would like you to use like full names of things. So just so I understand, you know what you're talking about. And that's it. The rest of your points are for using some sort of formatting. If you're not a psych major or haven't learned APA formatting yet, just use something consistent. MLA, AP, Chicago, as long as it's consistent, I don't really care. Just don't jump between like MLA and APA, right? Things like that. Spell check it. Have some sources, right? And these sources should be books, journal articles, things along those lines. Your textbooks don't count. Okay, so you've got to go beyond what's there. Hopefully you all know that like Wikipedia is not a scholarly source, right? Things along those lines. Everyone rolls their eyes when I say stuff like that, and then I inevitably get papers turned in citing like Wikipedia or someone's blog. So journal articles, books, ebooks at this point, right? Things along those lines. There's a lot of really great stuff out there. So that is due next week, but as per usual, if you need extra time, you can have it. Yeah, Debbie. Yes. So it is the 21st, which is a week from today. And again, flexible, but don't let everything go to the end of the semester in this class, because you have a lot with the group project at the end of the semester. So, alrighty, any questions logistically about anything going on with what you have coming up due? Alrighty, well, maybe not surprisingly, we're going to start today with the case study. I just always feel like it's the best way to try to get to know the disorder. We do get to do them on paper today. Hooray! And also I have my dry erase markers so you can write them on the board. Yeah, Amanda. So I think I have it set so that as soon as I graded it, you could see like what you got right, what you got wrong. So I think what you have to do is click on your actual score, and then it will take you into it. Let me not pass back the random things that are mixed in with this, like an old copy of the syllabus. Not gonna be that helpful. All right. So I will pass them out and then come back around and assign what parts I'm gonna have y'all do.
It shows the grade, but not the actual exam, because I integrated.
Okay, I'll look again. I help up with what the video doesn't always listen to me. Let's put it that way. While you guys are doing this. Okay, I'll take a look. Let me see. Yeah, I'm just gonna do 4 groups today, so I'll come around and tell you what to do or not. So I'll have the whole background. Identifying and background. And then I will have, if I could use, and you can do symptoms. And sorry. That's what you do symptoms and results, and then you open the type. Only up to you. I decided you just wrote it down to 3. So have you all been impact on life and family and treatment of the so decide whether you want to do symptoms and test results or if you want to do life stuff. And then let's have the symptoms and test results people also do diagnosis.
This is amazing. Yeah. So I think for information, the biggest thing to look at here.
Yeah, so I mean, this is a woman who was very intelligent, right? I liked the quote they had where she was a practical, positive person who did not suffer fools gladly. So it's just like that's what you think of when you think of an English, like the stereotype of an English teacher, right? So you know, here's someone who was pretty much functioning really well. Right, and then this horrible Berkeley happens. So what were her symptoms and testing results? Yeah. So I mean, again, think of the quintessential English teacher, like on top of things, keeping everyone else on task, right? And now, like during her assessment, just going and picking up the curtain and looking at it, and like can't tell you why she's doing it, but she thinks it's funny, right? Um, yeah, and then like the when she drew the squiggles, there you are. That should be good enough for you, right? Like I'm done. I mean, we all have those days, right? But probably not the best thing to do when you're doing something to assess like how you're functioning. Yeah, and so what happened? I realized like the way I have this laid out, there's not a good place to put like what the actual injury was, right? So is the frontal bone of her skull shattered? Um, and so the underlying brain was badly damaged, particularly on the left frontal lobe. And then there was moderate to severe damage in the right frontal lobe as well. So basically, whole frontal lobe not doing great from this damage. And so the diagnosis they gave her was yeah, I have frontal lobe syndrome, which is kind of not a thing, but that's okay. Sometimes we just like have labels we have to use. So, all right, what was your impact on her and her family?
Also, she had her two children. After she went back home after being hospitalized, she yelled and screamed at her kids, casted them through a full bedpan at them, and so they ran away, which caused her to go back into an institution. She would yell and swear at anybody if she didn't get away. She didn't realize, you know, the effect she was having on her family and other people around her. The family had had years of psychotherapy to rid themselves of their guilt and move on with their lives. And they visit her every 3 months. And at first, her memories were intact. She knew who they were. She could remember things about them. Later on, she would get really agitated when they'd be there for too long. And after they left, she wouldn't remember that they had been. It was very stressful for her family.
Yeah, imagine again being a tiny kid and like your mom going from being like this really nice, good person to, you know, not being able to control herself. Really tough. Yeah, the most heartbreaking thing to me was when the kids ran away, when they left a note that said, "Mommy doesn't want us anymore." Like, oh,
You're in a little picture.
yeah, like I can't, like my heart. Oh. All right, so what was her treatment and how effective was it?
We didn't have very much treatment available for the actual like result of the central lobotomy. I mean, the treatment before the injury was a full frontal left side lobotomy. Was it right side? It was left side lobotomy. And then the damage to the right side. All they did for her really was physical therapy to aid with her right side function. There was limited results because she was extremely difficult for her to stay on task, and therapists did not really have the ability to help her stay on task for her own. She did note some spontaneous improvement in her right side function. And then in order to kind of help her with the inhibition, they implemented some very rigid rules kind of to help from that kind of friction.
Yeah, sometimes that's people with brain damage, people with severe mental illness like schizophrenia. Sometimes the best way to make their lives as stress-free as possible for both the patient and those around them is to essentially end up teaching them like kids a little bit. So like in inpatient facilities for people with schizophrenia, they'll often implement what they call a token economy. So that's where they'll actually like kind of like Chuck E. Cheese, right? You get like the equivalent of tickets and you can trade them in for privileges. And it feels a little like, ooh, is that juvenile? Maybe, but it seems to work for those folks. So yeah, it could feel weird, but sometimes that's the like best thing you can do for folks. Yeah. So the frontal lobes, as you can see, super important. KNW have a quote that says all neural roads eventually lead to the frontal lobes, right? So in addition to the functions they do, they are kind of organizing everything else. So the frontal lobe, its function is often referred to as executive functioning because it's essentially the CEO of the brain. So it is the thing that tells you whether you put on your socks or your shoes first, okay, things along those lines. So it does things like help us do the right movements at the right time. So it does like information from internal cues and external cues and social interactions, and also self-knowledge is really situated here as well, like self-awareness, which again is why this is like a super, not superhuman, but very human part of our brain, right? So it binds together the awareness of yourself as continuous through time. It's sort of your understanding of your own timeline. The motor cortex is here, which projects to the spinal motor neurons and the cranial nerves that control the face. Not surprisingly, linked to those basal ganglia we talked so much about before the midterm, right? And there's like a premotor area that helps us plan motor fields. They get information and sort of bring it back to the occipital lobe. And that helps us to plan the movements as well. We also, as we started to hint at when we were talking about the aphasias, right? Here is probably the part of the brain where we see the most actual left brain, right brain, right? I hope everyone in here by now knows like we're not actually only ever using one part of our brain, right? No one is just all left brain or all right brain, right? But there is, sort of distinction between those two lobes, particularly in the frontal lobe. So the left does a lot with language and getting memories into long-term memory, which we call encoding. And the right does more nonverbal movements, facial expressions, and then retrieving the memory. So getting them out of long-term memory to a place where we can do them. So you basically use the left side of the frontal lobe when you're studying, and then you use the right side of the frontal lobe when you're actually taking the exam. And you got to pull that information out so you can use it. So let's see. Obviously, you can see a lot of different things that can happen when this area is damaged. Not only from this case, but I think talking about Phineas Gage will be sort of the best way to illustrate all of the things that can go on here. So as I was mentioning, probably most people have heard about Phineas Gage from intro or maybe another class. He is the guy who had a railroad iron go through his head and it went through the frontal lobe. So I have kind of a longish video about him. There's some reenactments. And as with most reenactments, the acting is what you would expect. So just heads up on that. But I think it's better.
September the 13th, 1848, near Cavendish, Vermont.
Just because a woman agrees to have her toes stepped on for one dance doesn't mean she's in love with you, Jimmy.
I suppose you're after thinking that she's taken by yourself?
Oh, I'm taking her out tonight. I'll ask her for you.
You liar! I happen to know that she's visiting her parents tonight.
And how do you know that, may I ask?
Because she can only see me tomorrow night.
I don't believe it.
Well, you can ask her yourself tonight.
After it ain't last night.
One more like that, James! James, I'll go after this Dorothy myself.
This is Phineas Gage.
Ah, come on now. Get up there and you start cutting down that brush. Benjamin, you get over here and start leveling off this timber. Now, off to it. Come on, you lot. What are you looking at? Got a lot of yards to make today. And time's money. Set in there, Billy.
Gage is an intelligent, well-balanced man.
Feeling better now, James? Yeah, that's my boy. You?
He's a modest and reliable person. He's in charge here because he can make careful, well-informed decisions.
He was the foreman of
All parts of a healthy brain work together. The red emotional limbic system passes on its messages to the blue intellectual frontal cortex, the part of the brain which assigns priorities to the messages.
You all know they're not.
Everything ready, Billy? Yep. Good. Give her lots of sun, Billy boy. Lots of sun. Okay. Give her lots of sun. I need him, Jeremy! Get back here both at once! As if you want to be working here tomorrow.
Normally, the two brain systems keep thought and emotion in equilibrium.
James? James? Yeah. Good.
He's still alive.
I'm okay. Come on, help me to my feet, boys.
Oh. I'm sorry.
No, I'm okay. I'm sorry.
Come on, lads. Let's get him to the village.
Almost a century and a half after Gage's accident, we can guess that his limbic system, frontal cortex, and the connections between the two were damaged by the passage of the tamping iron through his brain. The limbic system is now free to fire emotional messages without the restraint exercised by the frontal cortex.
So you have to imagine this is mid-1800s. What is the state of medicine then?
But why did Gage feel
They're
so
far
little
out from
pain?
town.
Normally, pain signals move up the spinal column to stations in the brain which pass on the messages to the frontal cortex. At the microscopic level of the neural net, information is passed on from cell to cell. It's through this system that the pain messages reach the frontal cortex. The passage of pain messages occurs partly through a chemical called substance P, which is projected across the tiny gap, the synapse, from one cell to the next. If enough of the chemical reaches the receptors of the next cell, the cell fires and the pain messages continue. Often when pain or stress occurs, endorphins are released. Endorphins are the natural morphines of the brain. Gage's pain was probably lessened by endorphins. diminishing the transmission of substance P across the synaptic gap.
Come on, you can make it, man.
Here, take this. It'll help you feel better.
Sometimes just believing in a cure is enough to dampen pain. Water has no pain-killing properties, but it may have given Phineas Gage some relief by triggering the release of more pain-resisting endorphins.
Oh, better.
If Gage had taken morphine, it would have inhibited cell firing by impairing the transmission of substance P, just as the endorphins do, blocking the pain signals.
Hurry, doctor. It's bad. I'm coming, man.
The young Edward Williams, a former railroad man himself, was the first doctor summoned.
Can you walk?
Yes. Let us through. The man's hurt. Tapping iron went right through his head.
Science's great interest in Phineas Gage was in how the severing of his frontal cortex from his limbic system completely changed his behavior and character.
Come on, Phineas. Let us take you up to bed.
Oh, no. Leave me alone. I just want to stay outside.
Phineas, you'll be better inside.
I'm staying right here!
It's Doc Williams.
Who?
Doc Williams.
Doc Williams. He is working up for you, Doctor.
Gage's words were prophetic. His historic case sparked widespread curiosity into how physical changes in the brain affect behavior.
God, Gage.
I don't know.
Okay, enough of this nonsense, Phineas. Let's get you off to bed right now. Come on, come on.
Oh, no.
Easy.
Samuel. Oh, back to work, eh, boys?
Come on, in the house. Come on. Come on, easy.
I think I've got the last piece of bones. Want to check, see if there's anything else down there.
They're having to
My
reach
right hand
in
is
and
touching
pull
my
out
left hand,
parts of
clear
his
through his head.
cheekbone, basically, that went up into his brain.
Once the connections between the frontal cortex and the limbic system are gone, the limbic system is free to fire its messages of emotion uninhibited by the frontal cortex. And behavior becomes erratic and unpredictable.
You know what I like, Doctor? I like to have my old dog up here. Come here, Biff! Here, boy! Come on!
Keep your head still.
Oh, Billy! Billy! Oh, wait.
Keep your head still.
Oh, I have to see the man, eh? Hey!
Easy. Lie back. Let's see what we can do about your dog, Phineas.
Go get Biff, Billy. Go get Biff, eh? Biff died. Biff, no!
Lie back.
Lie back. Sure, lie back.
I'm gonna sleep.
Against all odds, Gage survived. Physically.
Quite some time.
Hello?
But he never did regain his emotional and intellectual self-control, balance, and judgment. His ability to communicate with other human beings decreased, but he developed a special affinity for animals. But for the men Gage used to work with, he had become a man out of control. The balance between his emotions and his intellectual faculties destroyed.
Hey, wait up, man! Hey, don't leave without your foreman, hey! Oh!
Oh. We got a new foreman.
What?
Who?
Who? I'm the foreman now.
You. Benjamin. Oh. Oh, you can't take care of yourself, Benjamin, let alone a whole group of men, hey? Oh. Oh. I'm still in charge, hey?
We hope you'll be back, Phineas. But not today.
Hey, how can you take my job? Phineas Gage, I'm a better man than you, any day. The best foreman.
We'll come by later, Phineas.
I'm the best. I'm the best. No! Not that way! We're still at the cutting. The work's over there, and the explosion. Explosion? Oh.
It was not the man that was Gage.
He's like an animal now.
An animal's emotions in a man's body.
Gage died 12 years later, still unbalanced. At the Warren Museum at Harvard University, the tamping rod and Gage's skull are preserved, a monument to research into how physical changes in the brain affect behavior. Utilizing the most modern tools of brain science investigation, Doctors Hannah and Antonio Damasio at the University of Iowa Neurology Laboratory have studied Phineas Gage's skull and the tamping rod. They have been able to anatomically determine which areas of his brain were the most seriously damaged. Their investigation has revealed major damage to both prefrontal cortical areas, more extensively on the left side. This region is reciprocally connected with the subcortical nuclei involved with emotional processing in the amygdala and hypothalamus. When the prefrontal region is damaged in this way, an individual may not be able to control emotions that originate in these subcortical structures. This was profoundly evident in Phineas Gage.
All right, and so then the next video I have is shorter, if I can get it open. I swear to God, Zoom. You and I, one of these days. It's just the menu. The menu drives me bonkers. Oh, okay. Oh, that's part one. Part two. Okay, this one's shorter. And is, I believe, a piece of a Nova special about it.
This is the skull of Phineas Gage, who over 150 years ago became one of the most celebrated cases in the history of medicine, which is why he's still here in the Warren Museum at Harvard Medical School. A smart and likable young man, according to his friends, Phineas was working as the foreman of a railroad construction gang in Vermont when a blasting accident blew this 3-foot-long iron rod through his left cheek and clear through the top of his head. The rod landed about 25 yards behind him, and Phineas got to his feet and walked away. As a local newspaper put it the next day, the most singular circumstance connected with this melancholy affair is that he is alive and in full possession of his senses and free of pain. But while he lived another 12 years with part of his brain destroyed, he was, as his friend said, no longer Gage. He was described as fitful and grossly profane. On the one hand, impatient and obstinate, and on the other, unable to make plans for the future. Unable, in fact, to make up his mind. Phineas Gage's fame stems not only from his simply surviving such a ghastly accident, but because he was the first patient to suggest a link between personality and the functions of the front part of the brain, the frontal lobes. In this show, we're going to explore how our frontal lobes shape who we are and how we go about our lives. What's the area of the brain that was affected during this accident?
Well, I think the area that everybody focuses on is the frontal lobes. Now, there might have been some damage to areas a little bit outside the frontal lobes, but what makes this person and their case interesting to scientists is the fact that the injury was in the frontal lobes, and as a result of the injury, Gage's personality changed.
Can we tell what kind of personality? I mean, was it an inability to make decisions? Or, it's hard to tell.
It's hard to tell, other than the fact we know it changed. He couldn't resume his former position, although he did work afterwards. I mean,
but he wasn't good as a foreman.
He wasn't good as a foreman, which requires executive skills.
I brought a brain in a box here, and I wonder if you can show me where on the brain the accident affected him.
So these are the frontal lobes of the brain. This is the right side and the left side. And the rod probably entered somewhere from the bottom of the frontal lobes on the left side and came out somewhere on the top of the frontal lobes. So all the tissue in between here to here no doubt was damaged, as well as some of the surrounding tissue.
What was the thinking in those days about the relationship of the brain to the personality?
Yeah.
How did they organize their thoughts about that?
Well, there wasn't a lot of sophisticated thinking. Here's an example of such thinking. This is a phrenology skull, and you can see etched into the skull in different places are what might be called faculties.
Phrenology was invented by a very bright fellow called Franz Joseph Gall, who thought that different parts of the brain did different things. His mistake was in believing bumps in the skull reveal what lies beneath. Has any one of these areas shown to confirm? You don't even have categories
Alan,
like
it was
this
a
anymore.
crapshoot.
Yeah, I mean, benevolence. Nobody's looking for benevolence in the brain, right? Or are
we're
they?
all looking for benevolence, but not right now in the brain.
Reasoning faculties he's got over here.
So that's probably not a bad place to have it. There's probably some relationship between the functions of the frontal lobe and your ability to do certain kinds of reasoning.
He's got language under the left eye.
Yeah.
Is that possible? Is there? I mean, is that possible? Why would he say that? Is there brain under the left eye?
I don't know what kind of plaster cast he was studying in order to do that. There's no under the left eye is your left cheek.
Gall may have been wrong in the details, but his concept of the brain as an organ with specialized regions has been vindicated. And of all the specialized regions, none is more important in distinguishing us from the rest of the animal kingdom and from our pre-human ancestors than the enormously enlarged front part of our thinking brain, the frontal lobes or prefrontal cortex.
It serves as sort of the central executive, the chairman of the board of the brain, and it helps guide our behaviors. It helps us plan. It helps us carry out plans. It helps us reason about difficult topics. It helps us make certain kinds of decisions. It helps us inhibit behaviors that are not really appropriate, more primitive behaviors. For example, let's say you want to be on a diet and you love chocolate, and in front of you you see this wonderful, delicious chocolate cake, but you know you shouldn't have it.
Right. So,
well,
the back of my brain is
wants it,
and the front of my brain
is saying not good for me.
Right.
And so you're able to put it off because you have another goal. Maybe the goal is to lose weight.
Yeah.
Maybe the goal is to live longer.
Right.
So these goals are going to be much more important than this sort of short-term goal based on just seeing that chocolate cake in front of you.
My job is to make...
Okay. So that gives you a nice indication of what the frontal lobes are actually like, what they actually do. Right? Lots of different functions. So when they're injured, there's lots of different things that can go wrong. Just real quick before I go into those a little more, tell you a little bit more about Phineas Gage. Again, we kind of just hear like he couldn't be a foreman anymore, but as I alluded to, he actually did work for the next 12 years of his life. So he took to traveling. He visited the major New England cities. He did a brief stint at Barnum's Sideshow, so like Barnum and Bailey Circus. So he would actually like sit in a tent with the rod and just sort of like, I'm assuming he talked to people, but he was a sideshow event. And then he ended up working at a livery stable in New Hampshire. So this was for horses who typically were like rented out, things along those lines. And he, as they said, was really good with animals. So he did really well at this, and he would actually like drive the carriages and whatnot, which takes a decent amount of reasoning and memory as to where you're going, right? But then, so this happened in 1848, and in 1861, he started to suffer from seizures. Probably, again, as some sort of side effect of this long-term thing. And so his seizures were really severe. So on February 20th, he had, 1861, he had this really severe seizure. Again, thinking about the state of medicine at that time, not great. What they prescribed for his seizures was bloodletting, which is exactly what it sounds like. They used to literally either use leeches or like cut you and let it drain into a little pretty bowl. So, you know, didn't actually cure anything, as you can imagine, often just weakened the person. Yeah, so then on May 21st of 1861, he died having suffered several more seizures. They never did an autopsy, but as you saw, he did donate his skull and the rod itself to Harvard. So, yeah, I mean, yes, he changed, his personality changed, his ability to do the job he had before changed.
He also did have caretaking as a result. He didn't live into a facility, but he lived with family.
That makes sense. Yeah, yeah. But he was able to live, just like some of our other case studies, live a fairly fulfilling life with support, right? So I think the narrative is kind of like he was completely useless and just sort of like sat around like a lump for the next 12 years of his life, right? That we typically hear in like intro classes. Or we just sort of stop with this thing went through his brain and then he was no longer Gage, right? So yeah, it's important to know he was a man and he lived a decent life after that. Let's see, some of the other things that can happen with frontal lobe damage. We think just about motor functioning, loss of control, so fine movements, speed, strength. We do have neuropsych assessments to test this, including what is called, sorry, I can stop sharing here, including what is called the groove pegboard. There are these little pegs that only fit into these holes one way, and each hole is like a slightly different. And so it's essentially how quickly can you get them in there, and you're only allowed to use one hand the whole time, and they do it on each hand individually. So we can kind of look at how is that affected. We have loss of movement programming, so that planning movement that we were just talking about. We can have speech problems, particularly if it's linked to the parts of the motor cortex that do the facial muscles, or obviously Broca's area, which we've talked about previously. Frontal lobe patients are also impaired on divergent thinking, which is the ability to think of a variety of responses to a single problem or question. They will instead really only be able to come up with one and then fixate on it. You kind of saw this in Philippa's case, right? Where she would just fixate on one thing and not be able to change. Perseverance, yep, exactly. Related to that, we have a loss of behavioral spontaneity. So they're less likely to just sort of do stuff for the heck of it, right? So they do less, essentially, partially because it's more difficult for them to like plan things and plan movements and things along those lines. The biggest thing, as you saw with the first video, is inhibition. So a big part of what the frontal lobe does for us is inhibition. And this is actually one of the main reasons the frontal lobe is implicated in ADHD. Because essentially in folks with ADHD, that inhibition part of the frontal lobe isn't working. And so people are often amazed when they figure out that Ritalin and similar drugs are stimulants. Like, why are you giving someone who's hyperactive a stimulant, right? But what it does is it specifically stimulates the frontal lobe of the brain to help them inhibit those behaviors and focus. This is also why sometimes those drugs are used on the black market because they also can sort of do that for people who don't have ADHD. So I know when I was in high school, it was like a big popular thing for people to do this when they were like studying for the SAT. Not anyone I knew personally, there were just like articles everywhere about this new terror. Let's see, they have difficulties forming strategies. So if you give them a new task to do, they'll be overwhelmed by it. They have difficulties doing something like the Wisconsin card sort where the rules keep changing. There we go. Or even the Stroop where there's the different colored words and you're supposed to say the color instead of reading it. They have a really hard time with that. In fact, the Stroop itself is a really good measure of executive functioning for that reason. They take more risks. So there's actually a task called the Iowa gambling task. Sort of simulates, you know, what it would be like in a high-risk situation. And yeah, they are much more likely to take risks regardless of like their financial or otherwise safety. They have deficits in self-regulation. And they also have a harder time making associations between things, what's called associative learning. They have difficulty with temporal memory, which means essentially being able to put things from your own life into like a timeline. It's a really critical role for the prefrontal cortex in general. Social behavior and also sexual behavior. So Phineas Gage is a prime example of the social behavior changing, the changes in personality. If they have damage on the left frontal lobe, they'll have what's called pseudo-depression, where they have apathy, indifference, loss of initiative, reduced interest in sex. So that's the left side. If it is on the right side, you might see what's called pseudo-psychopathy. And this is essentially symptoms of antisocial personality disorder without actually having that disorder. So immature behavior, lack of tact and restraint, promiscuous sexual behavior, again, often without a regard to safety, so not using protection, things along those lines. Coarse language, lack of social graces, increased motor activity. So we may have seen, I don't know, nothing I've ever read talks about Phineas Gage's sex life, so we don't know if he had that part of it, but certainly the changes in immature behavior and things along those lines. There's some suggestion there may be some spatial deficits as well associated with damage to this area of the brain. So what I'm going to try to do here is I do have some slides that can show us some of what the neuropsych assessments for this look like. There we go. Geez, sometimes words. Yeah. Okay. I have two versions of it, and I'm not sure which is the one I actually want. So just because I have actual like slide numbers written down, but they changed between editions of the book. Of course, it's going to take forever for PowerPoint to open too. Cool. Thanks, computer. Super helpful. Oh, here we go. Starting to make some move. Maybe not. Keeps going from like 90 to 0. There we go. Yeah, ask me later. That'd be good. Okay. You know what, y'all? Nothing is easy, is it? That's 43. That's the symptoms in this one. That's imaging. Here we go. Totally different location in this version, but that's okay. So this shows you what we might use for some of these. The Tower of London we talked about before, which is what's in, if you've seen the first of the Andy Serkis Planet of the Apes, they have the ape do the Tower of London. The Stroop in Wisconsin's card sort we mentioned, the Thurston word frequency. Oh, it would help if I screen shared this on Zoom. I just realized. There we go. Hand dynamometry is actually just having the person do like a grip test, just their grip strength. Finger tapping is where you have them tap certain sequences and see if they can follow it. Have them do things like spelling tests or self-ordering. So it does have back here. Here we go. Some of the images of what these look like. So word fluency is another example where you ask them to come up with like words that start with certain letters. Typically, we tend to use letters that might elicit swear words to look for inhibition issues, right? So S could be all manner of shit related words. C could be cunt, right? Often we'll use F, A, and S, because you might get some F bombs in there. You can see fewer words than a normal control who might bang out a lot of these, right? They also can test this with drawing, where they try to get them to, I believe this is a copy task, and you can see where this person just kind of gets stuck on rotating one shape over and over. That's that perseveration. And people who have lack of spontaneity just kind of like get stuck. Just reminding you what the Wisconsin card sort looks like. It's the rules change as you go. So initially you might tell them whether they're right or wrong based on the color, and then it might change to the number, and then it might change to the shape, right? There's a card game that I'm now realizing is probably based on this called Flux. That's really fun, where you look for groups of things and some cards that are laid down. And then the Stroop, which we've talked about before, again, getting them to say the color rather than read it can be really tough for people who don't have the ability to inhibit. So even someone who doesn't have a frontal lobe dysfunction, it's difficult. You can like feel yourself having to stop yourself from reading, right? When you do this task. So it can definitely be a challenge, to say the least. Alrighty, I'm gonna make sure I'm not missing anything for you all, but I think those are all the highlights I wanted to hit here. The only other thing your book talks about is Korsakoff syndrome, which is alcohol-induced damage. And you have problems in the frontal lobe. Korsakoff's, I believe we also talked about when we talked about memory, because I have retrograde and anterograde amnesia. And this is the one that the alcohol company solved by putting vitamin B into their alcohol so that they didn't lose their best customers to thiamine deficiency. Oh, lovely. Okay, so if I don't see you tomorrow, have a great weekend this weekend. And we will start talking about, I believe, hemi neglect next week. Yes, so that's fun. We get to see all kinds of fun stuff with the drawing tasks for that.